Among the confidential archives bequeathed to the Virginia Historical Society in 1992, researchers uncovered a velvet-bound journal that had remained locked away for more than 100 years. The manuscript, penned in elegant cursive, included comprehensive logs of human births, deaths, and what the writer termed hereditary enhancements spanning 19 estates in the Savannah area throughout the 1850s. The journal's 9 entries cataloged stature evaluations, appearance details, ancestral trees, and alarming annotations regarding reproductive viability that resembled animal husbandry logs more than records of people. Most alarming, the concluding sections featured letters among estate proprietors, debating the triumphant execution of controlled reproduction schemes and revenue gains that surpassed conventional tobacco farming by 350%. What scholars unearthed in those faded sheets would unveil one of the most methodically brutal ventures in U.S. history, a syndicate so precisely managed that it functioned for almost 2 decades undetected. Before we dive deeper into the tale of what came to be called the Savannah Reproduction Plot, be sure to hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments which city you're tuning in from. We love hearing from our community of historical mystery seekers. The unearthing of this journal would eventually lay bare a reality so harrowing that multiple influential Savannah lineages effectively campaigned to seal the papers until well into the modern era. Savannah in the 1850s emerged as one of the richest hubs in the southern United States, its affluence constructed wholly on the toil of captive workers and the lush tobacco fields extending along the Ogeechee and Altamaha rivers. The metropolis's upper-class clans had become remarkably advanced in their farming endeavors, employing empirical methods to field cycling, earth stewardship, and animal husbandry that rendered their ventures some of the most lucrative nationwide. These identical clans, the Harringtons, the Montgomerys, the Sinclairs, and the Langfords, convened routinely at the Savannah Farming Association sessions, where they deliberated not solely on tobacco and cotton outputs, but also what they delicately termed workforce refinement. Amid this assembly of estate nobility navigated a youthful individual named Alexander Beaumont, whose kin had lately procured a humble tobacco estate named Willowbrook Plantation, about 25 miles south of Savannah. In contrast to his contemporaries, Alexander nursed concealed affinities for the burgeoning emancipation cause, although he adeptly masked these convictions beneath a veneer of Southern refinement. His patriarch had dispatched him to pursue agronomy at Yale, where he encountered forward-thinking notions on personal liberties and worth that starkly opposed all he observed upon his return to Georgia. Alexander positioned himself uniquely within Savannah's elite circles. His clan's freshly amassed riches ensured his inclusion in the core groups of entrenched estate families. Yet his newcomer standing permitted him to scrutinize their customs with novel, progressively appalled perspectives. What he unearthed in his initial year back in Savannah would contest all he believed he understood about the abysses of human barbarity. The summer gala period of 1853 ushered in the customary array of lawn soirees and nocturnal assemblies among Savannah's estate upper crust. It was amid one such twilight at the Harrington residence on West Broad Street that Alexander initially caught wind of a dialogue that would eternally alter his existence. Dr. Elias Harrington, the clan head and an esteemed healer, was conversing softly with Colonel Harlan Montgomery regarding what they dubbed the reproduction endeavor. The snippets Alexander grasped were troubling enough. Allusions to hereditary advancement, chosen couplings, and boosted efficiency, that he started attending more closely to akin exchanges at following assemblies. As fall descended, Alexander discerned trends in these talks that chilled his veins. The identical families who boasted of their purebred steeds and award-winning bovines were imposing parallel doctrines on the humans they enslaved. They discoursed on pedigrees, on aligning bodily features, on eradicating what they deemed inferior qualities. Most eerie of all, they addressed these issues with the identical dispassionate objectivity they might employ when scheming the mating of farm animals. The genuine magnitude of what Alexander was revealing crystallized during a December twilight at the Langford domain, where he beheld something that would torment him eternally. The Langford estate's primary residence shimmered with cozy lantern glow against the frigid December dusk, as Savannah's most prominent families convened for their yearly harvest festivity. Alexander appeared stylishly tardy, as anticipated of youths of his societal rank, bearing a compact leather notebook he had commenced utilizing to chronicle the alarming dialogues he persisted in overhearing. What he beheld that night, though, transcended mere dialogue. As the twilight advanced, and the elder gentleman withdrew to Colonel Langford's den for cognac and stogies, Alexander pardoned himself, feigning a need for crisp air. Rather, he stationed himself by the den's outer pane, where the December frost deterred other attendees from the lawn trails. The tones from inside transmitted distinctly through the ajar pane, and what Alexander heard caused his palms to tremble as he labored to scribe in the gloom. Dr. Harrington was reciting from what resembled an official dispatch, his timbre bearing the command of a figure habituated to unchallenged audience. "The outcomes from our 4-year endeavor have surpassed every forecast," he proclaimed. "Oak Ridge Plantation has yielded 19 births from our chosen matchings, with a mean stature rise of 3 inches above the prior cohort. More crucially, the offspring exhibit amplified bodily aptitude and resilience to typical maladies." Colonel Montgomery's timbre chimed in, and Alexander could detect documents shuffling. "The Sinclair ventures have proven comparably triumphant. Their emphasis on choosing for compliance while preserving bodily vigor has yielded extraordinary outcomes. The fresh cohort displays 30% reduced opposition to directives while upholding exceptional labor aptitude." But it was the third timbre that iced Alexander's blood. Colonel Langford himself was articulating, and his utterances disclosed the authentic breadth of their ventures. "Gentlemen, what we have achieved here transcends singular estate triumph. Our alliance now encompasses ventures in South Carolina, Alabama, and Tennessee. The reproduction logs we uphold enable us to monitor pedigrees across regional divides, guaranteeing prime hereditary blends that would have been unattainable in solitude." The noise of a seat grating against the planks was succeeded by footfalls, and Alexander flattened himself against the chilly stone barrier as Colonel Langford persisted. "I possess here the seasonal dispatches from our associate estates. The Caldwell's venture in South Carolina has triumphantly generated 47 births employing our controlled reproduction guidelines. The offspring are being appraised for allocation to our alliance participants predicated on their anticipated aptitudes." Alexander felt nauseous as the ramifications clarified. These figures weren't merely handling humans as beasts. They were managing a synchronized alliance that traversed numerous regions, methodically reproducing individuals for targeted qualities and apportioning the offspring like goods. Dr. Harrington's timbre resumed, now debating what he termed the logging guidelines. Each birth must be logged with exact dimensions, ancestry data, and forecasted worth appraisals. Our logs now hold exhaustive data on over 900 persons across the alliance. This information permits us to scheme reproduction blends 6 years ahead. The dialogue endured for another hour, amid which Alexander acquired particulars that would subsequently occupy scores of sheets in his notebook. They debated reproduction dwellings where youthful females were maintained expressly for procreation, sire choices where males were selected for their bodily attributes, and yield appraisals where offspring were assessed like farming yields. Most appalling of all, they articulated of offspring who failed their benchmarks being rerouted to ordinary farming ventures. A euphemism Alexander comprehended signified detachment from kin and transfer to estates where longevity was markedly reduced. As the twilight wrapped up and the gentlemen commenced dispersing, Alexander stayed concealed in the lawn until assured all had left. The papers and dialogues he had observed that night unveiled something vastly more methodical and extensive than any he had envisioned. This wasn't the vicious caprice of lone estate proprietors. It was a structured undertaking with bookkeeping, revenue forecasts, and interregional synchronization that functioned with the proficiency of any prosperous commercial endeavor. Trekking back to his own estate that night, Alexander resolved a choice that would shape his life's trajectory. He would discover a means to penetrate this alliance, chronicle its ventures, and unveil the verity to the globe. What he didn't comprehend was that his probe would eventually unearth proof of customs so methodically savage that even veteran emancipation advocates would labor to accept his narratives. The reproduction alliance that Alexander had chanced upon signified something unparalleled in the annals of U.S. bondage, a synchronized effort to impose empirical doctrines to human procreation on a commercial magnitude, managed by some of the most esteemed clans in Southern circles. The week succeeding the December assembly morphed Alexander from a dormant spectator into an engaged saboteur. though he swiftly discerned that securing entry to the Alliance's core mechanisms would demand more than societal ties. The reproduction syndicate, as he began to conceive it, functioned with strata of confidentiality that shielded its most injurious actions from incidental unearthing. Participants corresponded via encrypted missives, conducted clandestine sessions at varying sites, and preserved their most exhaustive logs in fortified spots distant from their chief abodes. Alexander's initial advance arrived via his camaraderie with Theodore Sinclair, the junior offspring of one of the Alliance's originating clans. Theodore, scarcely 23 and zealous to validate his merit to his kin's confidence, had lately been awarded entry to what his patriarch dubbed the progressed farming ventures. Unlike the senior cohort, who articulated in prudent circumlocutions, Theodore's juvenility rendered him more heedless with specifics, particularly when imbibing. Amid a January twilight of gaming and bourbon at the Savannah Society, Theodore bragged about his clan's groundbreaking tactics to workforce oversight and referenced something that accelerated Alexander's heartbeat. The Sinclair estate upheld what Theodore dubbed reproduction lodgings, dedicated accommodations crafted expressly for their controlled reproduction scheme. More vitally, Theodore noted that his patriarch had bestowed him entry to the primary archive, a thorough ledger that monitored pedigrees, reproduction chronicles, and what he termed hereditary advancements across the whole alliance. Alexander realized that obtaining entry to this primary archive would furnish the proof required to unveil the complete extent of the Alliance's ventures. Nonetheless, infiltrating the Sinclair estate would necessitate meticulous orchestration and substantial hazard. The reproduction lodgings were situated in a secluded segment of the estate, rigorously overseen and rigorously prohibited to outsiders. The primary archive itself was secured in a bolted vault within the estate's chief bureau, reachable solely to elder kin members. Over the ensuing months, Alexander devised a prudent tactic. He commenced wooing Theodore's sibling, Eliza Sinclair, utilizing their amorous bond as camouflage for recurrent visits to the estate. Eliza, a clever and vivacious lady who echoed some of Alexander's advanced perspectives on learning and societal overhaul, unwittingly became his gateway into the clan's private ventures. Their bond, which originated as computed deceit on Alexander's behalf, progressively matured into authentic fondness, appending another stratum of ethical intricacy to his quest. Through Eliza, Alexander secured summons to kin suppers, communal assemblies, and ultimately nocturnal lodgings at the estate. Each sojourn permitted him to amass reconnaissance about the site's configuration, safeguard protocols, and functional timetables. He discerned that the reproduction lodgings accommodated roughly 45 females aged 17 to 32, all chosen for what the clan dubbed ideal procreative traits. These females were maintained in circumstances that were corporeally agreeable by bondage norms: superior nourishment, tidier dwellings, healthcare, but were subjected to procreative dominance that was utter and methodical. The males chosen for the reproduction scheme were cycled among estates within the Alliance, their displacements meticulously monitored to assure hereditary variety while upholding coveted qualities. Alexander uncovered that the Alliance preserved exhaustive wellness logs, kin histories, and even temperament appraisals for each person in their reproduction scheme. Offspring born into the scheme were appraised at birth, with those fulfilling precise standards being nurtured in dedicated creches while others were parted from their maters and apportioned to other estates. By the vernal equinox of 1854, Alexander had amassed sufficient reconnaissance to essay his most audacious penetration yet. Eliza had referenced that her patriarch would be journeying to Alabama for a zonal alliance session, leaving the estate under the watch of the superintendent. This hiatus would afford Alexander his optimal chance to access the primary archive and the reproduction lodgings themselves. What Alexander unearthed during that May twilight would disclose the authentic breadth of the Alliance's ventures and furnish him with proof of methodical human liberties infringements that stretched far beyond any he had formerly envisioned. The primary archive encompassed not merely logs of the Savannah vicinity ventures, but exhaustive missives with akin alliances in Tennessee, Alabama, South Carolina, and even as distant as Louisiana. The reproduction scheme wasn't confined to a minor cluster of Georgia estates. It was a synchronized undertaking that spanned the entire South. But the most troubling unearthing awaited Alexander in the reproduction lodgings themselves, where he would at last observe directly the human toll of the Alliance's empirical approach to human procreation. Alexander's chance arrived on a muggy May twilight, when a vernal downpour supplied the ideal veil for his penetration of the Sinclair estate's most covert ventures. Eliza had withdrawn early with a migraine, and her patriarch's absence signified the primary residence was sparsely manned. Employing his acquaintance with the estate's configuration, Alexander navigated through the ornate lawns toward the aggregation of edifices that accommodated what the clan euphemistically dubbed their specialized farming amenities. The reproduction lodgings inhabited a complex of 7 edifices erected in a rectangular array around a central patio. Unlike the cramped captive huts found on most estates, these constructs were built with scrupulous regard to aeration, expanse, and even modest ease. Alexander realized forthwith that the ameliorated circumstances served a computed intent. Robust, well-nourished females were more prone to yield robust offspring that rendered the scheme lucrative. Maneuvering prudently through the obscurity, Alexander neared the principal dormitory edifice. Through the partly ajar blinds, he could perceive rows of berths organized with martial accuracy, each inhabited by a youthful female. What impacted him most was the hush. No discourse, no motion, merely the murmur of serene respiration from females who seemed slumbering despite the premature twilight hour. Only subsequently would Alexander learn that the females were administered mild tranquilizers each twilight to guarantee adherence and thwart interaction that might foster defiance or evasion scheming. The second edifice contained what appeared to be medical amenities with inspection platforms, balances, and gauging apparatuses that Alexander identified from animal husbandry practices. Exhaustive diagrams adorned the partitions tracking lunar cycles, dietary consumption, and what were evidently gestation timetables. The clinical exactitude of these logs turned Alexander's gut as he realized that every facet of these females' procreative existences was overseen, logged, and governed with empirical technique. But it was in the third edifice that Alexander unearthed the most troubling proof of the scheme's methodical approach to human reproduction. This construct functioned as both a creche and appraisal hub, where neonate offspring were evaluated for their hereditary promise before being designated to diverse paths within the Alliance. Diagrams on the partitions classified offspring by corporeal dimensions, conduct appraisals, and forecasted fiscal worth. Those adjudged elite inventory were flagged for exceptional tending and instruction, while others were appointed for ordinary farming assignment. The primary archive, which Alexander ultimately accessed in the estate's chief bureau, contained proof that the Alliance's ventures were far more expansive and refined than any he had formerly envisioned. The ledger documented 1,256 persons across 19 estates with exhaustive kin trees, tracking hereditary lineages back 4 cohorts. Reproduction timetables were schemed years ahead with precise matchings crafted to augment specific qualities, while eradicating others deemed undesirable. Most jarring of all were the missive dossiers which disclosed that the Alliance upheld active dialogue with akin ventures in other regions. Letters from Alabama debated triumphant reproduction results and proffered to exchange hereditary inventory for reciprocal gain. Correspondence from Tennessee delineated novel methods for appraising reproduction promise and suggested collaborative enterprises for broadening ventures. A missive from an estate in Louisiana incorporated exhaustive fiscal forecasts, indicating that specialized reproduction ventures produced revenues 4 times greater than conventional tobacco cultivation. As Alexander transcribed sheet after sheet of proof by taper glow, he commenced to comprehend that he had unearthed something unparalleled in U.S. annals. This wasn't merely the savage exploitation of captive individuals. It was the methodical imposition of empirical doctrines to human procreation on a commercial magnitude managed by esteemed members of Southern circles who regarded their actions as farming novelty rather than human liberties infringements. The Alliance's triumph had encouraged its participants to broaden their ventures and hone their methods. Fresh missives debated schemes for founding reproduction amenities in Florida and Mississippi, areas where terrain was more affordable and supervision was scant. Other letters delineated trials in instruction and preparation, endeavoring to yield not merely corporeally adept laborers, but persons with specialized proficiencies that could demand elite rates in metropolitan bazaars. Alexander expended 5 hours in the bureau, laboring by the faint radiance of a solitary taper, as the downpour thundered outside. By Aurora, he had chronicled sufficient proof to unveil the Alliance's ventures to officials, but he also realized that the Alliance's participants encompassed some of the most potent figures in Georgia. Magistrates, statesmen, and esteemed communal guides were all entangled in the missives he had unearthed. Unveiling them would necessitate more than proof. It would demand a tactic that could surmount their sway and societal bonds. As Alexander navigated back through the estate's terrains in the ante-auroral obscurity, he was already scheming his subsequent maneuvers. The proof he had amassed was condemnatory, but he knew that the Alliance's participants would resort to drastic measures to safeguard their ventures and their renown. What he didn't realize was that his penetration had already been unearthed, and that the Alliance was poised to illustrate precisely how far they were prepared to proceed to conserve their enigmas. The youthful female who had been observing from the obscurity of the primary residence would soon relay Alexander's nocturnal actions to her overlords, initiating a sequence of occurrences that would essay not solely Alexander's dedication to equity, but his very endurance. The morn succeeding Alexander's penetration brought an unanticipated caller to Willowbrook Plantation. Colonel Langford materialized unheralded, escorted by two figures Alexander didn't identify. One presented as Dr. Reginald Voss, depicted as an expert in estate safeguard, and the other merely as Mr. Barrett, whose frigid gaze and marred palms intimated a history in pursuits far detached from agronomy. Their attendance at Alexander's morning repast engendered an ambiance of scarcely veiled peril that rendered every utterance feel perilous. Colonel Langford's inaugural civilities bore subtle menaces enveloped in Southern politeness. "Alexander, my lad, we've grown anxious about some anomalies in our farming ventures. It appears someone has been evincing an atypical curiosity in our confidential commercial techniques." His grin never faltered, but his gaze stayed riveted on Alexander with rapacious fervor. "Dr. Voss here excels in pinpointing and rectifying safeguard lapses that might imperil our farming novelties." Alexander compelled himself to preserve equanimity while his intellect surged through feasible retorts. His schooling at Yale had encompassed discourse and oratory, but naught had readied him for this juncture, where a solitary erroneous term could unmask him as a peril to figures who had illustrated their readiness to handle humans as assets. He elected for bewildered guilelessness, voicing bewilderment about any safeguard worries, while subtly inquiring for data about what they might discern. Dr. Voss inclined forward, his timbre bearing clinical exactitude that reminded Alexander uncomfortably of how the Alliance debated their reproduction ventures. "Mr. Beaumont, we have grounds to believe that someone with entry to our communal assemblies has been chronicling private dialogues and possibly accessing classified logs. Such actions signify not merely a violation of societal decorum, but a direct menace to legitimate commercial ventures." The scarcely concealed imputation lingered in the atmosphere like vapor from a firearm. Alexander realized that his bond with Eliza Sinclair had afforded him entry, but it had also rendered him conspicuous to individuals whose endurance hinged on upholding utter confidentiality. Barrett, who had stayed mute throughout the dialogue, was examining Alexander with the concentration of a figure appraising potential ferocity. His attendance wasn't fortuitous. He was there to manage whatever resolution Dr. Voss and Colonel Langford deemed essential. Alexander rendered a computed choice to alter the interplay by voicing his own worries about dubious actions he asserted to have observed. "Gentlemen, I'm genuinely relieved you've approached me with these worries. I've been perturbed by some dialogues I've overheard at communal assemblies. Talk about farming ventures that seemed atypical. I've pondered if someone might be exploiting our societal bonds to amass intelligence for rivals or even governmental operatives." This retort caught his callers off guard, compelling them to contemplate whether Alexander was a peril to be eradicated or a prospective Confederate to be enlisted. Colonel Langford traded glances with Dr. Voss before retorting. "What precisely has perturbed you about these dialogues, Alexander?" Alexander trod a prudent boundary, exhibiting knowledge that verified he had been attending while portraying himself as someone anxious about shielding the Alliance rather than unveiling it. He referenced hearing debates about reproduction guidelines and hereditary advancements that made him wonder if other estate proprietors were attempting to pilfer their novelties. This tactic permitted him to disclose his knowledge while situating himself as protective rather than menacing. Dr. Voss's retort unveiled the profundity of the Alliance's suspicion and the extents they were prepared to go to safeguard their ventures. Alexander, what you've depicted implies you comprehend the groundbreaking essence of our farming novelties. These techniques signify years of empirical evolution and considerable pecuniary investment. More crucially, they signify approaches to workforce oversight that certain political factions would deliberately misconstrue if they became communal knowledge. The dialogue persisted for 2 hours, amid which Alexander learned that the Alliance had already pinpointed him as a potential safeguard hazard. Eliza Sinclair's chambermaid, a female named Lydia, who had been born into the reproduction scheme, had observed Alexander's nocturnal displacements and relayed them to her overlords. The Alliance had been monitoring Alexander for weeks, appraising whether he signified a peril to be eradicated or an asset to be enlisted. Barrett ultimately articulated, his timbre bearing the subdued command of a figure accustomed to ferocity. "Mr. Beaumont, we confirmed that you accessed the Sinclair domain's private logs 2 nights prior. We have an observer who beheld you transcribing documents from the primary archive. You now hold information that could demolish legitimate commercial ventures and devastate reputable clans." Alexander felt his meticulously built veneer crumbling as Barrett persisted. "However, Dr. Voss believes you might be valuable to our ventures rather than menacing to them. Your Yale schooling and your clan's recent procurement of estate property render you potentially utilitarian for broadening our Alliance's capabilities." What ensued was a proposition that unveiled the Alliance's ambitious schemes for expansion and Alexander's impossible stance. They proffered him a selection: join their ventures as a full participant, contributing his estate to their reproduction alliance and his schooling to their empirical technique, or confront the repercussions of menacing their safeguard. The repercussions weren't explicitly articulated, but Barrett's attendance rendered the implications evident. Just when we thought we'd witnessed the pinnacle, the terror in Savannah escalates. If this narrative is sending shivers down your spine, hit that like button and share this video with a friend who loves dark history. Let's uncover together the next twist in this chilling saga. Alexander solicited time to ponder their proposition, knowing that his reply would determine not solely his own destiny, but potentially the future of hundreds of captive individuals ensnared within the Alliance's methodical reproduction scheme. As his callers departed, leaving behind an ambiance of scarcely contained menace, Alexander realized that his probe had attained a pivotal nexus. He now held sufficient proof to unveil the Alliance. But accomplishing so would necessitate him to elude from figures who had illustrated their readiness to eradicate menaces to their ventures. The youthful emancipation advocates, who had appeared so assured in their New Haven sessions, had never envisioned the refined and perilous essence of the system they sought to demolish. Alexander's reply to the Alliance's ultimatum arrived 3 days subsequently, conveyed in the guise of fervent acceptance of their summons to join their ventures. He materialized at the appointed assembly locale, a secluded chamber above Whitaker's Inn in central Savannah, bearing a leather dossier that he asserted contained exhaustive schemes for transforming Willowbrook Plantation into a specialized reproduction amenity. What the dossier truly contained would soon metamorphose a gathering of assured plotters into a frantic battle for endurance and unveil the authentic expanse of their ventures across the American South. The chamber above Whitaker's Inn had been selected for its seclusion and manifold egresses, standard safeguards for figures conducting commerce they couldn't afford to have eavesdropped. The venue itself was possessed by Josiah Freeman, a liberated black individual whose stance in Savannah circles required prudent navigation between the rivaling concerns of white benefactors and the captive community who occasionally sought his discreet aid. Unknown to the Alliance participants, Freeman had already consented to assist Alexander in chronicling their assembly through a series of tactically positioned auditory apparatuses that would seize their dialogues for posterity. Colonel Langford, Dr. Voss, Barrett, and 7 other Alliance participants had convened to formally induct Alexander into their entity and receive his estate's contribution to their expanding ventures. The gathering signified the grandest convocation of Alliance leadership that had transpired in over 2 years, convened by the import of appending a Yale-schooled participant to their cadre and the potential for broadening ventures into fresh areas. The ambiance was jubilant, with costly Spanish sherry and felicitations on Alexander's sagacious choice to join the vanguard of Southern agronomy. Dr. Voss had readied a formal exposition about the Alliance's empirical accomplishments, replete with diagrams and graphs that illustrated the quantifiable advancements they had attained through controlled reproduction schemes. The exposition unveiled specifics about their ventures that even Alexander hadn't surmised, encompassing collaborations with healing academies that furnished empirical counsel on heredity and procreation. Alexander learned that the Alliance's sway extended into scholarly establishments throughout the South, where instructors of natural science and healing furnished conceptual backing for their reproduction schemes. Missives of cooperation from esteemed scholars at the University of Alabama, the Academy of Savannah, and even Yale Healing School illustrated that the Alliance's ventures had intellectual validity within the empirical community of the era. These scholarly collaborations furnished both empirical trustworthiness and political shielding that rendered their actions appear as legitimate farming inquiry rather than methodical human liberties infringements. The Alliance's pecuniary triumph had enabled them to finance inquiry into what Dr. Voss dubbed progressed reproduction methodologies that transcended mere controlled matching. They had evolved exhaustive psychological appraisal techniques for evaluating temperament qualities, instructional schemes crafted to augment the worth of their yields, and even trial healing procedures intended to enhance fertility ratios and diminish neonate mortality. The breadth of their empirical aspirations unveiled a degree of methodical dehumanization that stunned even Alexander, who thought he had grasped the full extent of their savagery. Alexander enacted his role impeccably for nearly 2 hours, voicing zeal for the Alliance's empirical tactics and appreciation for being entrusted with their groundbreaking methods. He presented exhaustive structural sketches for converting his captive lodgings into reproduction amenities, replete with healing inspection chambers, specialized creche amenities, and what he dubbed hereditary logging hubs that impressed even Dr. Voss with their attention to methodical proficiency. The schemes were so persuasive that several Alliance participants requested duplicates to enact at their own ventures. During his exposition, Alexander unveiled that he had been corresponding with estate proprietors in Florida and Mississippi who were intrigued by founding Alliance ventures in areas where terrain was more affordable and federal supervision was scant. This data exhilarated the Alliance participants who perceived opportunities for colossal expansion that could multiply their revenues while diminishing the hazards linked with operating in entrenched regions where emancipation sentiment was intensifying. The metamorphosis commenced when Alexander opened a second segment of his dossier, elucidating that he had brought logging to illustrate his dedication to their shared vision. "Gentlemen," he proclaimed, his timbre steady despite the swift throbbing of his heart, "I believe you'll find these logs illustrate not solely my comprehension of your methods, but my capacity to enhance upon them through methodical logging and analysis that exceeds even your current refined tactics." What Alexander unveiled were not schemes for joining their alliance, but scrupulously transcribed logs from their own primary archive, missive dossiers, reproduction timetables, and pecuniary forecasts. Sheet after sheet of proof that chronicled every facet of their ventures, from singular reproduction designations to revenue forecasts, from interregional synchronization to schemes for territorial broadening. Healing logs, hereditary diagrams, and personal missives that unveiled the intimate specifics of their methodical approach to human reproduction. The documents encompassed proof that Alexander had amassed over months of probe, but also fresh revelations that he had unearthed during his 3 days of readiness for this clash. Employing his entry to Eliza Sinclair's confidence, he had procured letters from Alliance Ventures in Tennessee that depicted triumphant reproduction schemes involving over 350 captive persons. Correspondence from Alabama unveiled collaborations with captive merchants who specialized in locating persons with specific corporeal traits for reproduction intents. Most damaging of all were pecuniary logs that showed the Alliance had generated revenues exceeding $900,000 over the prior 6 years, funds that had been utilized to acquire political sway and finance expansion into fresh areas. The figures around the board realized concurrently that Alexander hadn't arrived to join them. He had arrived to annihilate them with proof so thorough that refutation would be impossible. The hush in the chamber endured only moments before Barrett maneuvered, reaching for the firearm he bore beneath his mantle. Alexander was readied for ferocity, but the refined essence of his scheming transcended mere corporeal readiness. His months of probe had encompassed not just document amassing, but prudent synchronization with alliances of emancipation advocates and liberated blacks who were stationed throughout Savannah to react to predetermined cues. The weighted strolling cane that Alexander bore as a modish adjunct became an armament that struck Barrett across the forearm with sufficient vigor to propel his firearm whirling across the chamber. But that was solely the inception of Alexander's protective tactic. The clamor of shattering crystal from the inn's ground level signified that Josiah Freeman had triggered the crisis scheme they had evolved, cueing Confederates stationed throughout the edifice and environs. What ensued was turmoil that overflowed beyond the secluded chamber into the inn beneath and out into Savannah avenues. Dr. Voss lunged for the documents strewn across the board, while Colonel Langford bellowed commands to obstruct the egresses. But they swiftly unearthed that their assembly had been foreseen and encircled. The Alliance participants found themselves ensnared in a chamber that had become a meticulously built enclosure, with escape paths monitored and proof of their actions being transcribed by multiple observers. Alexander battled his path toward the pane overlooking the lane behind the inn, clutching the most damaging proof against his torso while employing his strolling cane to hold his assailants at bay. Behind him, the Alliance participants were shouting conflicting commands, some demanding chase, while others insisted on reclaiming and demolishing the proof before it could be rendered communal. The refined synchronization they had employed to manage their reproduction alliance now labored against them as they struggled to react to an unanticipated menace. The pane shattered as Alexander hurled himself through it, landing harshly in the lane, but upholding his grasp on the documents that signified months of perilous probe. However, his evasion was component of a grander scheme that involved generating multiple duplicates of proof and apportioning them to trusted Confederates before the Alliance could orchestrate an effective retort. Even if Alexander were seized or slain, the proof would endure to unveil their ventures. Behind him, the Alliance participants were unearthing that their crisis contingency schemes were inadequate for the circumstance they now confronted. Figures who had materialized from lateral avenues and edifice entrances, whom they had presumed were laboring to thwart Alexander from evading, were actually emancipation advocates and liberated blacks who had been stationed to shield Alexander and ensure that proof of the Alliance's ventures reached security. The pursuit through Savannah's riverside quarter illustrated both the Alliance's expanse and assets, and the efficacy of the counter-alliance that Alexander had assembled over months of prudent scheming. What appeared to be a frantic evasion was actually a meticulously orchestrated venture crafted to unveil the reproduction alliance while shielding the proof and observers needed to guarantee their indictment. Alexander attained the Altamaha River wharves not as a runaway seeking evasion, but as the pivotal persona in a clash that had been schemed to compel the Alliance's ventures into communal view. The vessel awaiting at the wharf contained not just provisions for evasion, but printing apparatus and supplementary duplicates of proof that would be apportioned throughout Savannah before the Alliance could orchestrate an effective retort to suppress the revelations. Josiah, the liberated black mariner, whom Alexander had asserted was insensible from assault, was actually synchronizing the apportionment of proof to multiple locales throughout the metropolis. The apparent assault had been staged to render the Alliance participants believe they had triumphantly disrupted Alexander's evasion scheme, when in verity they had strolled into a snare that would unveil their ventures to communal examination. Standing on the wharf with proof that could annihilate some of Savannah's most potent clans, Alexander confronted the juncture he had been readying for since his initial unearthing of the Alliance's ventures. The clash would determine not solely his endurance, but the destiny of hundreds of captive individuals ensnared within the Reproduction Alliance and the future of akin ventures throughout the South. Barrett emerged from the obscurity with his firearm poised, flanked by 9 other figures whose visages Alexander identified from Savannah's communal assemblies. These weren't contracted ruffians, but esteemed members of circles who had elected to shield their concerns through ferocity, unveiling the depths of corruption that enabled the Alliance's ventures. "Mr. Beaumont," Barrett proclaimed, his timbre bearing lethal command, "you've engendered a circumstance that requires prompt and enduring resolution. Those documents must be demolished, and your knowledge of our ventures must be eternally confined." Alexander's retort unveiled the authentic breadth of his scheming and the impossible stance the Alliance now confronted. Rather than retorting with dread or rebellion, he grinned and gestured toward the environs where scores of observers had convened to behold the clash. "Gentlemen," Alexander proclaimed, his timbre transmitting distinctly across the port, "I believe you'll find that confining this circumstance is no longer feasible. The proof you're so anxious about has already been apportioned to reporters, federal probers, and emancipation alliances in 7 diverse metropolises. The revelation that their assembly had been not just beheld, but logged, and that proof of their ventures was already beyond their capacity to suppress, metamorphosed the alliance participants from pursuers into pursued. The methodical approach they had employed to manage their reproduction schemes now labored against them, as their scrupulously upheld confidentiality was stripped away by equally methodical exposure. What transpired next on that Savannah wharf would subsequently be contested by enduring observers. But the repercussions echoed through Southern circles in manners that none of the participants could have foreseen. Alexander, confronted with armed figures who signified some of Savannah's most potent clans, rendered a choice that metamorphosed a regional clash into a nationwide outrage that attained the chambers of Congress and swayed the intensifying debate over bondage's future in America. Rather than yielding the documents or attempting to combat impossible probabilities, Alexander did something that caught his chasers completely unprepared and illustrated the refined essence of his scheming. He commenced reciting aloud from the Alliance's own logs, his timbre transmitting across the port as he intoned names, dates, and specifics of reproduction ventures that entangled not just the figures confronting him, but scores of esteemed clans throughout Georgia and adjacent regions. The communal recitation was not a frantic deed, but a prudently schemed element of Alexander's tactic to guarantee that proof of the Alliance's ventures could not be suppressed through ferocity or intimidation. As his timbre transmitted across the wharves, wharf laborers, mariners, late twilight voyagers, and denizens of proximate edifices commenced to convene, drawn by the jarring essence of what they were hearing. Each term Alexander articulated engendered additional observers to data that the Alliance had slain to shield. Barrett and his associates found themselves confronting a throng of observers to data they had committed manifold homicides to conceal. Alexander persisted reciting, his timbre growing more robust as more individuals convened to hear proof of customs that most had never envisioned feasible. The Alliance participants realized that silencing Alexander now would only affirm the verity of what he was unveiling to scores of observers while failing to act, would permit him to persist, unveiling their ventures to an ever-expanding audience. The documents Alexander recited from encompassed not just the reproduction logs he had originally unearthed, but supplementary proof that unveiled the Alliance's bonds to captive merchants, healing experts, scholarly establishments, and political personas throughout the South. Names of prominent Savannah clans were linked to specific reproduction ventures, pecuniary dealings, and missives that illustrated their direct entanglement in methodical human trafficking and compelled procreation. As Alexander persisted his communal exposure, the convening throng began to encompass persons whose own clans had been impacted by the Alliance's ventures. Liberated blacks who had been born into reproduction schemes, former captives who had beheld the parting of clans for reproduction intents, and white citizens who had unwittingly conducted commerce with Alliance ventures, found themselves hearing documented proof of actions that explained enigmas and calamities from their own encounters. The clash concluded not with ferocity, but with the arrival of Savannah municipal officers, drawn by accounts of a disturbance at the wharves and the expanding throng that had convened to hear Alexander's revelations. However, the officers found themselves in an impossible stance, as Alexander's communal recitation had engendered scores of observers to proof that entangled some of their own political and societal superiors. The intricacy of Savannah's societal hierarchies engendered a moment of juridical and societal stasis that permitted Alexander to complete his exposure of the Alliance's ventures. When the officers ultimately intervened, Alexander voluntarily yielded himself and the documents to their guardianship. Knowing that the communal essence of his revelations had rendered it impossible for the Alliance to suppress the proof through ordinary channels of sway and intimidation, the officers found themselves holding proof of methodical crimes that entangled some of the most potent figures in Georgia, engendering a juridical and political crisis that extended far beyond their capacity to resolve through ordinary procedures. Dr. Voss attempted to discredit Alexander's revelations by asserting the documents were fabrications crafted by extremist emancipation advocates to harm innocent estate clans. But the exhaustive essence of the logs, encompassing data that could only have originated from inside the alliance, rendered such refutations increasingly arduous to sustain. Several observers in the throng identified names and dates that corresponded to occurrences they had personally beheld or encountered, furnishing independent affirmation of the document's authenticity. The prompt aftermath of Alexander's exposure engendered turmoil within Savannah's societal elite that extended far beyond the reproduction alliance itself. Clans scrambled to distance themselves from documented actions while concurrently attempting to discredit or suppress proof that menaced not just singular renown, but the entire societal framework that bolstered their lifestyle. The methodical essence of the proof Alexander had amassed rendered selective refutation impossible, compelling the alliance's participants to select between comprehensive concealment endeavors and complete relinquishment of their ventures. Within hours of the wharf clash, duplicates of the alliance's documents had been apportioned to Gazette bureaus in Savannah, Charleston, Nashville, and Boston. The proof attained emancipation alliances that had been seeking precisely this type of documented confirmation of methodical reproduction ventures, furnishing them with material that would fuel anti-bondage contentions for years to come. Federal probers who had been scrutinizing violations of inter-regional trade statutes related to captive trading found themselves with proof of synchronized criminal actions that crossed regional boundaries and entangled esteemed political personas. Alexander himself vanished from Savannah within days of the wharf clash, but his departure was component of a prudently schemed extraction that had been synchronized with emancipation alliances before his ultimate clash with the reproduction syndicate. Rather than fleeing in alarm, Alexander was relocated to secure abodes in Boston, where he expended months collaborating with reporters and probers to verify and expand upon the proof he had amassed. His exhaustive knowledge of the alliance's ventures furnished the foundation for probes that ultimately unveiled akin reproduction ventures throughout the South. The alliance's retort to exposure unveiled both the extent of their sway and the limitations of their authority when confronted with methodical proof amassing and communal exposure. Several pivotal observers, encompassing wharf laborers who had heard Alexander's revelations, received offers of substantial inducements to recant their testimony or deny what they had beheld. When inducement failed, some observers suffered enigmatic mishaps or vanished entirely, illustrating the alliance's readiness to employ ferocity to shield their concerns even after their ventures had been unveiled. However, the alliance's endeavors to suppress proof through intimidation and ferocity only affirmed the verity of Alexander's revelations and furnished supplementary proof of their criminal actions. Federal probers began treating observer intimidation as proof of culpability rather than guilelessness, leading to expanded probes that unearthed pecuniary logs, missives, and corporeal proof that had been overlooked during the initial exposure. The alliance's endeavors to conceal their actions engendered a trail of supplementary crimes that rendered indictment easier rather than more arduous. Logs at participating estates were hastily demolished in the weeks succeeding Alexander's exposure, but the methodical essence of the alliance's ventures signified that complete demolition of proof was impossible. Reproduction logs, pecuniary dealings, missives, and corporeal alterations to estate amenities had engendered a documentary trail that extended across multiple regions and entangled hundreds of persons. Even partial demolition of logs left sufficient proof to reconstruct the alliance's ventures and identify supplementary participants who had not been named in Alexander's original revelations. Key alliance participants temporarily relocated to properties in other regions or areas where their renown remained intact, but their flight from Georgia was interpreted by probers and the communal as admission of culpability rather than innocent relocation. The relinquishment of their Savannah properties and societal positions furnished supplementary proof of their entanglement in criminal actions, while their endeavors to establish fresh identities in other locales led to probes that unveiled akin reproduction ventures in South Carolina, Tennessee, and Alabama. The pecuniary impact of exposure proved devastating to the alliance's ventures, even where juridical indictment was arduous due to political bonds and the complexities of bondage statute. The methodical reproduction schemes that had generated enormous revenues required absolute confidentiality to uphold elite pricing for their yields, and communal exposure demolished the market for captives bred through methodical schemes. Estate proprietors who had invested heavily in reproduction amenities and specialized personnel found their investments worthless when purchasers refused to acquire captives associated with unveiled reproduction ventures. Eliza Sinclair, who had unwittingly furnished Alexander with entry to her clan's ventures, suffered a complete emotional breakdown upon learning the true intent of his courtship and the extent of her clan's entanglement in methodical human reproduction. Her personal calamity reflected the broader societal upheaval engendered by revelations that compelled Savannah circles to confront the methodical savagery that had operated within their esteemed communal circles. Some clans demolished by the outrage relocated to areas where their renown remained intact, while others attempted to rebuild their societal standing through benevolent actions crafted to illustrate reformed attitudes toward human liberties. The Sinclair clan's endeavors to distance themselves from their documented entanglement in reproduction ventures led to internal conflicts that ultimately demolished both their pecuniary position and their societal standing. Eliza's younger sibling, Theodore, whose heedless revelations had furnished Alexander with initial reconnaissance about the alliance, challenged his patriarch's endeavors to deny their clan's entanglement and furnished supplementary proof to probers in exchange for immunity from indictment. The clan's communal disputes over responsibility and knowledge engendered supplementary proof of their entanglement while demolishing any possibility of upholding unified refutation. Dr. Voss's endeavors to uphold his healing practice and empirical renown failed as proof of his entanglement in human reproduction experiments became communal knowledge. His missives with healing academies that had furnished empirical counsel for reproduction schemes entangled scholarly establishments throughout the South, leading to probes that unveiled the intellectual foundations of methodical human reproduction and the extent to which esteemed empirical establishments had furnished legitimacy for criminal actions. The Savannah Reproduction Alliance ultimately disbanded, not through juridical indictment, but through the impossibility of upholding ventures that required absolute confidentiality once their methods had become communal knowledge. The pecuniary losses from relinquished ventures and relocated assets bankrupted several participating clans, while others found their societal and political sway permanently damaged by association with documented human liberties infringements. The alliance's refined synchronization, which had been their greatest fortitude during years of triumphant operation, became their greatest vulnerability once exposed to communal examination. Federal probes ultimately led to indictments under interregional trade statutes, rather than direct challenges to bondage itself, as the alliance's ventures had violated existing statutes governing the conveyance and vending of captives across regional boundaries. Several alliance participants were convicted of conspiracy and fraud charges related to false logging of captive origins and reproduction histories, while others confronted pecuniary penalties that demolished their economic positions even without criminal convictions. Alexander Beaumont's destiny remained unknown for decades, until kin papers bequeathed to Yale University in the 1930s unveiled that he had survived his evasion from Savannah and expended the remainder of his existence collaborating with subterranean alliances that aided captive individuals escape to liberty. His logging of the Reproduction Alliance's ventures became some of the most damaging proof presented to Congress during debates over bondage that preceded the Civil War, furnishing concrete examples of methodical abuses that challenged the protective justifications employed to defend bondage as a benevolent establishment. The primary archive that Alexander had transcribed vanished from communal record after the initial probes, leading some chroniclers to speculate that potent concerns succeeded in suppressing proof of customs too methodical and extensive to acknowledge without menacing the entire societal structure of the pre-war South. However, recent unearthings in private kin papers and domain logs have unveiled that reproduction alliances akin to those documented in Savannah operated throughout the South, most more triumphant than the Savannah operation in upholding confidentiality and demolishing proof of their actions. Contemporary chroniclers estimate that methodical reproduction ventures may have affected tens of thousands of captive persons throughout the pre-war South, signifying a form of methodical dehumanization that transcended the already horrific conditions of bondage to handle human procreation as a commercial process subject to empirical management and revenue optimization. The Savannah Alliance's exposure furnished a glimpse into customs that were likely far more extensive than historical logs indicate, as most akin ventures triumphantly demolished proof of their actions. The enduring impact of Alexander's exposure extended beyond the prompt demolition of the Savannah Alliance to sway broader debates about bondage and human liberties that ultimately contributed to the political frictions leading to the Civil War. Proof of methodical reproduction ventures furnished emancipation advocates with concrete examples of bondage's dehumanizing effects that could not be dismissed as exaggerated advocacy. While Southern defenders of bondage found themselves unable to justify customs that handled human procreation as agronomic science, this enigma illustrates how frameworks of oppression can function with empirical precision and societal respectability when those in authority elect to handle humans as economic assets rather than individuals deserving of dignity and liberties. The Savannah Reproduction Alliance signified not just singular savagery, but institutional malevolence that required synchronization, scheming, and intellectual justification to operate effectively. The Alliance's refined ventures demonstrate how methodical dehumanization can be normalized through empirical language and societal acceptance, while Alexander's exposure reveals the power of singular valor and methodical logging to challenge even the most entrenched frameworks of abuse. What are your thoughts on this chilling tale? Do you believe the full extent of the truth has been uncovered? Or are there still dark secrets hidden in Savannah's past? The evidence suggests that the Savannah Alliance was just one piece of a much larger puzzle of systematic reproduction ventures across the South. Drop your thoughts in the comments about how such methodical abuses could hide within respected institutions. If you're gripped by this story and crave more historical mysteries that unearth America's hidden truths, hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and share this video with a friend who loves diving into the shadows of history. We'll see you in the next chilling chapter.